Hi, I'm attorney Melissa Levine-Pirro, and I'm the owner of Levine-Pirro Law in Maynard, Massachusetts. It's a pleasure to welcome you to Insider's Guide to the Law. It's our very first episode. Each week we'll bring to you legal experts from various fields to provide their expertise and knowledge in various fields of the law. While we can't answer specific legal questions, we'll do our best to provide general legal knowledge that you, the viewers at home, would like to know. At the end of each show, we'll provide an address where you can send your questions into, and each month we'll pick some of those questions to answer on the show. Today with me, I have Stefano Caprera of Caprera Law PC in Acton, Massachusetts. Welcome to the show, Stefano.
Thanks for having me.
So you primarily practice business law, correct?
Yes, yeah.
So small businesses, I mean, it's hard. We're both business owners. It's difficult to run a business. And you deal with a lot of the challenges that small businesses face on a day-to-day basis.
I do. Yeah, a lot of people call me asking for various questions. And you'd be surprised some of the things that business owners encounter every day.
So one thing I hear small businesses talk about all the time and ask questions on is how they should incorporate their business, if they should incorporate, if they should stay a sole proprietorship or a partnership. Can you speak to this at all and the challenges those small businesses face?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. That's one of the first questions that I get when I'm on the phone with a prospective client and talking about their business. You know, we really go into the reasons why people make decisions to incorporate or stay a sole proprietor. So I kind of briefly touch on some of the things that are out there. There's really three main areas or three main structures that you can go with. The first is sole proprietorship. Everyone has been a sole proprietor probably one time in their life. If you were selling lemonade from a lemonade stand, you'd probably be considered a sole proprietor. And then the second two major ones are limited liability companies, LLCs, and incorporations or corporations. And that's when someone refers to the term as incorporating, that's really the corporation structure they're looking at. And one of the key things we discuss in determining whether to go from the sole proprietorship level to a formal structure like an LLC or a corporation is really dependent on the goals, of the individual. Who are the stakeholders in the company? What are they looking to accomplish? Are they going to be a regional business, a smaller business, or are they going to be located outside the state? Are they going to be expanding internationally? So those are the types of things we like to focus on to decide on what the best structure is. And then we really recommend on going forward with either the LLC or incorporation, depending on what suits their needs.
And I hear that LLCs offer a lot of flexibility, and that's why a lot of smaller businesses choose them. What's the flexibility that's offered with an LLC?
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the main benefits of LLCs. It's a relatively young form of corporate entity. And what an LLC does is the LLC statute of Massachusetts really gives the owners or the members of that LLC the flexibility to dictate how they run that company. And all this is stated out in the operating agreement that they would put together. And really, it could vary on how the proportion of profits or distributions are given to each member, how the losses are applied, and really who's in control of what aspects of the business. So this is a very attractive entity for companies, especially now. It's becoming very popular, and people use this as a form because of the flexibility. And because of one of the things the flexibility provides is that you don't need the documentation that you would need as a corporation. Corporations are required by statute to have certain things in place, whereas the LLC, you can dictate on what things you really need to do.
And with an LLC, is it expensive to set up with the state of Massachusetts?
As far as with the Massachusetts, you have your filing fees, which are about $500, $520 if you're filing online. And then if you ended up using an attorney to assist you with the process, or if you ended up using other services, those charge fees as well. And really the expense is the filing fee, but understand that one of the key differences between a sole proprietorship and an entity is the documentation required afterwards. Now you have more tax obligations afterwards. You have to file additional returns. You have to have documentation in corporate records. Whereas a sole proprietor is less formal, less requirements for these types of things. So it's just not only the initial filing expense you need to take into consideration, you really need to take into consideration your yearly expenses in operating. But once you get over a certain threshold of revenue, I really think it's a direction that suits a lot of businesses when they go that way. So.
And aside from the filing fee, is there an annual report fee that you have to file with the state?
Yeah, there is. So on a yearly basis, there's an additional $500 or $520 if you file online for LLCs. And that's really the state of Massachusetts saying this is your fee to continue operating in good standing in the state of Massachusetts. So when you file your annual report with the state, you would pay your annual fee. A lot of companies, let's say if they end up incorporating or filing their LLC, organizing their LLC, they think they're done. And then 2-3 years down the line, they realize that they're no longer in good standing by the state. And then they realize they have this obligation to now pay their back year annual reports. But interesting, comparing it to corporations, the fee for an LLC is about 3 to 4 times more than a corporation. Corporation annual report fees are about $125, $100 to file online. But the reason for that is because Massachusetts probably knows that LLCs are very popular, and they know that LLCs are a great choice for a lot of people, and that's why the fee is a little higher. As far as nationwide, for example, if we compare it to Delaware, Massachusetts LLCs are a little bit more on the expensive side, running about $200-300 more per year. So,
okay.
Yeah.
And I heard you mention operating agreements. Can you just explain briefly what an operating agreement is?
Yeah, so operating agreements are specific to LLCs, and really the LLC Act provides for a list of laws or regulations that apply to LLCs. However, a large majority of those can be contracted out of through an operating agreement. So let's say you didn't have an operating agreement at all. Really, if something occurred with your business, with your partner, or anything else, to determine how it applies, you'd have to go to the law, the LLC, Massachusetts LLC law. Whereas an operating agreement allows you to carve your business out of that and state your own way of running your business. So you would state who are the managers. What are those managers empowered to do? If you have certain officers, you can dictate who the officers are. And also membership interest. Who owns the company? How much do they own? One of the key things to keep in mind, a lot of people, when they organize an LLC, they'll state online that they have managers, and I'm the manager of the company. But unfortunately, it doesn't say who the owner is. It doesn't say who the member of the company is. So when you want to prove to someone that I do own my company, an operating agreement is a great way to do that. It will state who owns a percentage of what and who has a decision-making power. So a lot of times banks will not even open a business account without that operating agreement in place.
If you're just going to be a single sole member LLC, do you think it's necessary to have an operating agreement?
Yes, I still think it is. I highly recommend any LLCs to have an operating agreement in place. One of the key things that an operating agreement does is it sets out how you run your business, in the sense that if you do something that is outside of that operating agreement, for example, take an action that someone interprets to be your personal action as opposed to your business action, you can now turn to the operating agreement and say, listen, I've put this in place, I'm running my business, and this is a business action or a business decision that I've done. The big issue and the one benefit, one of the major benefits, legal benefits to starting an LLC or a corporation, is establishing what's called a corporate veil, and really separating the liability from the business entity to your personal assets, to you personally. And so what that does is that if you don't actually run your business, setting up an operating agreement and dictating how that business is going to be run, someone can interpret that as saying, well, you're running your business personally. That's a good argument for piercing the corporate veil, meaning you can come through the corporate protection or the LLC protection and come after the individual's personal assets, which will nullify your whole goal of setting up the entity in the first place.
Right, so it sounds like it's definitely necessary to have that operating agreement in place before you start doing business.
Right. Is it required by law? No. If an operating agreement is not in place per the LLC Act, it will say oral agreements or whatever verbal agreement is in place. But unfortunately, we all know how hard it is to prove what he said and she said with regards to anything. So that's why putting it in place, and it doesn't need to be complicated. It can be stating out the major things and deciding on how tax treatments are made, but you really need to write these things down and have even if you're signing your own operating agreement, to show that you're acting in your capacity as an owner as opposed to you individually. So yeah.
And then in terms of writing things down, even if a business wasn't going to incorporate as an LLC or as a corporation, if they're going to go into business with, let's say, 1 or 2 or 3 other partners, I assume that the same advice would be given, have some kind of partnership agreement. Exactly.
And that leads into a great, more of like an ancillary form of, we talked about the 3 major sole proprietor, LLC, and corporation. A very common one is partnership. You have your general partnerships, limited liability partnerships. But really, if 2 sole proprietors come together and they say, we want to do business together, we have a common goal, A sole proprietor, by definition, is just one person.
Right.
If you have two people, that now creates a partnership. What people need to keep in mind is you need to write this stuff down, because especially if you're trying to protect yourself from the actions of your partner. A general partnership exposes you to the liability of the person you do business with. If they do something, you're personally liable for those actions. And that's what the reason for a limited partnership is, to separate those. If you just want to be an investor and you don't want to run the company, you now can protect your personal assets to the extent of your investment. But as far, not to get too much into the weeds, the sole proprietor, if two sole proprietors come together to do work, you definitely need to write this sort of stuff down, because it just avoids complications in the future. You hope that you'll never have to look at that document again. I always say when I draft documents that your goal is to never have to look at this document again, because you can always agree. But in the event you don't agree, you need to turn back to something that's just there as a foundation and say, how are we going to resolve this issue without wasting more time and more money? So.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. I know that businesses always want to save money. You know, they don't like spending money on attorneys, which I understand.
Right.
I don't either. What about sites like LegalZoom that offer to do it quickly and cheaply? What are your thoughts there?
LegalZoom is a great resource for individuals looking to get almost like a how-to with doing certain things. Let's say around the house, you want to install a new faucet, you get a how-to on how to do that faucet. LegalZoom is a perfect tool to do that. What it does, it provides documents. It provides standard form documents really across multi-states in how to, let's say, do an LLC. It would provide you a stock form LLC operating agreement. And then it leaves it to you to decide, does this apply to your business? Is this what you want for your business? And if it's very general, you do need to sign and make sure the records are in place. Also, LegalZoom sets up the business, but as far as maintaining the records, making sure your record book is up to date and in place, that's definitely something that needs to be considered when you start a corporate entity, which LegalZoom doesn't really take care of, unless you opt for them to oversee and provide legal advice. That's the one distinction, is that LegalZoom, and they say it right on, or any other service, like, they don't provide legal advice. They provide the service to incorporate your business. But in the end, one of the key components is, why are you selecting an LLC? Why are you selecting a corporation? Should you be incorporated in Massachusetts? Should you be incorporated in Delaware? When does it make sense to be located in which jurisdiction? And when do certain responsibilities apply to your business, as opposed to you having to figure out what the responsibilities are and then turning to LegalZoom to fulfill them? So that's really, I think, the value in using a lawyer, is that they understand your relationship and look down the road to potential pitfalls that may come. So for example, you're thinking of hiring an employee, the lawyer will look out. What are your obligations? What do you need to do? And going through in that sort of fashion. So.
And you mentioned Delaware, and I know that businesses are always here like, I should register in Delaware. If you want to speak to that at all, or if they're doing online sales, do they need to register as a foreign business in every state that they're doing a sale in? Those are some common questions I hear.
So first, to the Delaware topic, a lot of people will say, well, Delaware's the place to be, and a lot of times I'll hear, because the taxes are great. The main reason why Delaware is such an attractive place for commerce is because the business law within that state is very developed. And what that means is that a lot of judges have decided on cases, and now the case law or precedent there is very developed. So you know how a case or court will decide on a certain issue. So that means it's very predictable. And this is good for investors. This is good for people wanting to invest in your company. Also, Delaware is very pro-investment. Their decisions come down more on the side of investors as opposed to minority shareholder rights and things like that. So what ends up happening is that if you came to me and said, hey, I want to start a business and I'm looking to, it's a startup company, which is very common in Boston, tech startup, looking to raise funds in the future, not really going to be a local mom and pop shop or brick and mortar, more looking to online sales and exposure nationwide and worldwide. I would recommend going to Delaware, because investors, and for that matter, incorporation as opposed to LLC, because investors like to see that. They like to see something common. They like to see something recognizable, and international investors especially. Delaware is the gold standard for U.S. corporate law, so that's what they like to see. But on the flip side, if you came to me and said, hey, I'm looking to start a local business, we're looking to have a regional market, which a lot of businesses in this area do, I would recommend a local Massachusetts LLC. That'll serve your needs, and you don't need to file foreign reports. To touch on the lines of foreign sales, you're required to file, and it all depends on what state, but in general, you're required to file a foreign certificate or registration when you start to transact business within that state. And what does that mean? Well, transacting business is basically when you have a presence in the state and you're running your business. So for prime example is having an office location. Let's say you have an office in New York and you have an office here in Massachusetts. You would need to establish foreign certificates in both locations.
If you're doing internet sales, which is very common these days between eBay, Etsy, and all those online Amazon forums, does that count as having a presence in those states?
I would say no, because you're transacting the business, you have a physical place in Massachusetts. Let's say your home base is in Massachusetts. You use providers. For example, I had a client focus on a cloud base in another state. They say, well, my servers are in another state. Does this mean that I need to register as a foreign entity out there? And no, that's not the case. You're contracting those individuals to provide you that service.
Right.
Your transactions are occurring here in the state.
Right.
Right. So.
And then another common issue that when you start a business in the day of online branding is that you create these awesome logos, taglines for your business. Right. Is there a way to protect that so other people can't use it?
Yeah, there is. And there's a kind of a scale of what you can do with trademark protection, and that's the key word there, trademark. So you can protect your trademark both nationally and internationally. So what you would look as is the USPTO. The United States Patent and Trademark Office, and they basically would allow you to trademark your logo or slogan or whatever it is, and you identify to the country that I'm using this, and this is for the purposes that I'm using it for, and that will protect it for those purposes. But there are ways to protect if you didn't want a trademark. Let's say it's just a local business. You still have protections as an individual with a trademark. There's a common term that or logo that everyone sees is the TM versus the R with the circle, and a lot of times I'll see someone use the R with the circle and say, well, hey, it's a trademark, I'd like to have an R with the circle, and I say, well, did you register that with the USPTO? And they will say no. Then you can't use the R with the circle. The only time you can use the R with the circle beside your logo is if you register with the USPTO. And what I would recommend to those people who still want to protect and identify to people we are using this logo for commerce is use the TM. You see that often, the TM beside a logo, that you're allowed to use. And you're just identifying that this is a trademark that we're using in commerce. So, but the one disadvantage of not registering is that it's limited to your region. So if you're only operating your business in Massachusetts and someone in California decides to take your logo and use it, and you really haven't done any sales there, you haven't really done any work in California, then they have a legitimate argument to say, well, your scope didn't extend out here. Whereas if you wanted to register nationwide, you would register your trademark for the filing fee, and basically that would protect you nationwide. And then if you wanted to go internationally, the Madrid Accord allows you to protect your trademark internationally with treaty countries, but that's more for international commerce. So. Yeah.
Do you think it's necessary for small businesses to trademark?
No, I don't think it's absolutely necessary. I do think it's necessary if you decide to start looking outside. Again, it comes back to the goals of the company. If the goal of the company is not to expand and really to look to a regional market, then establish yourself as a regional market, and you would establish that trademark protection that you're entitled to by common law. And so if you decide you want to expand, say we're going to start a base in Massachusetts, however, my goal is to go nationwide. If you have a cupcake company and you want to mail your cupcakes all around the country, you want to establish that trademark protection, because what ends up happening is if someone on the other side of the country sees, hey, that individual is doing great work, has good brand recognition, but they don't operate a business out here, I'm going to take advantage of that, and I'm going to register on top of that. And so if they can prove that they're doing that in that region prior, they can maybe have an argument to take trademark over that individual. So again, it all depends, again, what your logo is. Is this very dependent on brand image? If it is, I would recommend securing that brand image. But if it's just you and your business, then you won't need to do that until you've established a lot of brand recognition. And one of the biggest unfortunate things that will happen is when you dump a lot of money and resources and marketing into developing your brand, and then you realize you're actually infringing on somebody else's. So you got to change everything. So in order just to make sure when you're investing your money into your brand, if you want to retain that value, then trademark and understanding if you're not infringing on anyone else, a registration will do that for you. So.
And talking about your branding and really working under a name, I know a lot of companies, and I do it, are registered as such and such LLC or such and such corporation,
Right.
but they do business under a different name.
Right.
Is that allowed legally?
Yeah, you can operate your business under any name you really want, as long as two things happen. You're not using a name that's already used by somebody else, which is unless you have their permission to use it. And second, if you do operate under a different name, that's not your, and I say legal name, whether it's your entity or you as a person. So a lot of people will confuse the term DBA, meaning sole proprietor. And a lot of times that's not the case. Most of the time it is the case, but sometimes it's not, because a sole proprietor, for example, Stefano Caprara, if I operate a landscape company and I say Stefano Caprara Landscape, then it's okay. So basically I'm running under my own name, I'm a landscaper, people hire me, they know who I am. But if I say, Greengrass Landscape, I need to register with the town that I'm operating in. So if I was in Acton, I would have to go to town hall and file what's called a doing business as certificate, or that's the DBA, or business certificate with the town of Acton. You would pay your fee, and then it would identify to the public if something happened with Greengrass Landscape and I needed to know who's responsible. Nobody knows it's me. So what they do is go to the town and they say, hey, who's responsible for this? They'll pull up the record and see that, oh, Stefano Caprara is responsible for this. Same goes for a corporation. If you operate under a different name than a corporation, you have to go to the town that you operate in and say that I'm operating under a different name.
And does getting that DBA certificate from the town suffice as a business license for the town, or do you also usually need to get a business license as well?
It all depends on the type of business that you run. If the town requires an additional business license on top of what you're running, then you would have to get that as well. But the certificate is basically, again, the business certificate is what you would get to identify to people that you are operating in the location.
So one thing I do want to mention as we're getting towards the end of the show is the importance of contracts for small businesses. I feel like so many small businesses do things on a handshake, which is great in certain scenarios. But in other scenarios, you really need that contract, just like the operating agreement that lays out the terms and things like that. And I hear small businesses say, I don't want to use a contract. It's too laborious. People are going to look at me. They're not going to want to read it. What's your take on that as an attorney who deals with this day in and day out?
If it was a perfect world, I would say everything would be written down and there'd be documentation of every decision. That's a perfect world. Obviously, the way business runs and the pace that it runs in, a lot of times this doesn't occur. So handshakes happen often. Depending on what type of business, handshakes are a staple of getting deals done. I would highly recommend, if it's anything of significance, of importance that you depend on, whether it's a new contract or a new client, hiring someone, I would put together a contract to outline what the terms are. It doesn't need to say every specific little term. It just needs to set out the major terms and how things are going to be resolved in the issue that the individual doesn't follow through or you're not paid. So you really want to document really as many things as you can. Like I said, in a perfect world, at very least you'd write an email to say this is what we've said, this is what we agreed to. But for example, a lot of main contracts, people say, well, I got to do a contract every time I got to sell something. Well, that's what purchase orders are for. That's what these purchase orders that refer to major contracts, there's ways to make things convenient, but also protect yourself. And documentation is a key way to do that. So.
And you just touched on it too, and we could spend a whole show on it alone, hiring people.
That's right.
And employment contracts. I know that they can be short, they can be long, they can have different things. You mentioned tech companies. Do you usually advise that people put in confidentiality clauses, non-compete clauses, things of those nature?
Yeah, they are used often. In general, with employment, I would recommend keep it brief if you're the employer. Make sure you just touch on the main points and allude back to an employee handbook. And that's where you would determine your terms, and you can change as needed without having the employee to sign every single time. The more restrictions you put into an employee contract, it's detrimental to the employer, because Massachusetts is what's called an at-will employment state. And so if you start to apply terms, if you start to apply length of time or benefits, you're not contractually obligated to provide those. You can't now just say, I'd like to change. So make sure you retain the rights that are there for an employer. But also, an employee handbook is a great way to say, oh yeah, we do have benefits, but they're in our handbook. And then the second way was with tech companies and with a lot of employment contracts. A lot of times contractors will be used. In those cases, I would recommend getting a little bit more detailed. If you use a contractor, you're hiring someone like you're hiring someone else. They're not an employee, so make sure it's clearly stated that they're not an employee, to make sure you don't have to provide them with their withholding and their taxes and their workers' comp and things like that.
And I assume with any of these contracts, this is something that an attorney could do for business owners.
Exactly, yeah.
And help them and tweak the documents as needed throughout the history of the business.
And that's what goes back initially to why is it important to really establish a relationship with an attorney early on. Because when you incorporate a company, when you organize an LLC, the obligations just start there. You never know what these things will come up, and that's why it's important to establish early on. And then that lawyer will grow with your business, and hopefully will be there as a resource for your business going forward.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for all this information. It's been a great day hearing all this from you. I hope it can help our viewers. Again, if you have any questions at home, please mail them to us here at the studio. We'll provide an address on the screen for you to mail them in, and each month we'll pick some of those questions to answer. Thanks again for watching.